When we think about the British Empire in India, the story that often comes to mind is one of straightforward conquest, decline, and domination.
Yeah, it feels very neat, doesn't it? Like a clear-cut case of one power replacing another.
Exactly. But what if we told you that picture is, well, almost entirely incomplete? What if the making of British India was a far more complex, even paradoxical process?
Rooted deeply in transformations within India itself, things happening long before the British fully cemented their hold.
That's precisely what we're going to unpack today.
We're taking a deep dive into that fascinating period, the late 18th and early 19th centuries in India.
And our primary guide is a really rich source. Indian Society and the Making of the British Empire, part of the New Cambridge History of India series from 1988.
Yeah, it's a foundational text for understanding this period.
So our mission for you today is to go beyond those usual narratives. We want to reveal the intricate dance between indigenous Indian dynamics and the growing British presence.
How a vibrant, rapidly changing India not only responded to new colonial powers, but in many surprising ways actually shaped their arrival and success.
Get ready to see how an empire wasn't just imposed from the outside, but in many ways kind of emerged from the existing fabric of Indian society.
Often in collaboration with or, exploiting existing Indian structures.
And to truly understand this emergence, we have to start not with the British, but with India itself. Say around 1700.
Right, because many might picture a weakened, fragmented subcontinent at this point.
But our source paints, a much different picture.
A really different picture.
Exactly. You might be wondering if the Mughals were supposedly in decline, what was happening?
Well, the sources show a massive population, about 180 million people. That's roughly 20% of the entire world's population then.
Wow.
And largely still under the broad hegemony, the influence of the Mughal dynasty.
So even at the turn of the 18th century, Emperor Aurangzeb, he still commanded immense military might and treasure.
Oh, absolutely. The Mughals had fairly recently conquered independent Muslim kingdoms in the Deccan and suppressed Sikh revolts in the Punjab.
So this wasn't some crumbling empire in 1700 just waiting to fall.
That's a crucial distinction.
Mm-hmm.
While the traditional narrative often focuses on the fall of the Mughal Empire after Aurangzeb's death in 1707.
Which is the story most of us know.
Right. But our sources suggest a more nuanced crisis, more like a profound dynamic transformation rather than a simple collapse.
Okay.
Yes, imperial finances were strained, definitely. And factional conflicts did paralyze the center after 1712. But European traders at the time, they still viewed the Mughal emperor as one of the world's great rulers.
So not a power vacuum just waiting to be filled.
Not at all.
So this crisis or transformation, it had several layers, didn't it? It wasn't just about the Mughals fading away.
Precisely. First, there were these cumulative indigenous changes already underway.
Yeah.
Things like a growing commercialization of the economy, the formation of entirely new social groups, and significant political shifts happening within the subcontinent itself.
And second,
it was part of a wider Asian phenomenon. The decline of other great Islamic empires like the Ottomans and the Safavids. This wasn't unique to India.
Right. Context is key. And then the third piece of this puzzle was the accelerating European expansion.
Yeah, the massive growth of European production and trade, coupled with more assertive national states back in Europe.
Which indirectly fueled European trading companies' increasingly aggressive policies in India from the 1730s onwards.
Especially the English company after 1757. It's almost like, as you said, external pressures met internal changes, creating a kind of perfect storm.
That makes sense.
And this dynamic period saw really significant shifts in power structures. The old established Mughal noble households began to break up or were radically reshaped.
Why was that?
Well, their traditional system of revenue assignments, Jagirs, started to unravel. And in their place, social groups that had long been overshadowed by the Mughal nobility began to truly assert themselves.
And these weren't necessarily the traditional elites we might think of.
Not always. We're talking about new Hindu and Muslim revenue farmers, often adventurers, sometimes even relations of the old nobility, but operating in a new way.
How so?
They combined military power with shrewd financial expertise. We also see the rise of powerful merchant groups, free cavalry soldiers, and Hindu administrators.
So what's truly fascinating here is how these shifts weren't just about new people getting power, but new ways of exercising power.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the concept of commercialization during this period. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
It wasn't just a slow increase in the use of money. It was a fundamental shift in how society functioned. It meant using objective monetary values to express social relationships.
Wow. Okay. Can you give an example?
Imagine this. Things like royal shares in agricultural produce, rents, proprietary rights over land, even offices and positions of power were increasingly being bought and sold.
So money wasn't just for buying goods, it was actively shaping relationships of power and status in really unexpected ways.
Yeah.
That's a profound change.
It is. And how did it happen? Our sources tell us it was through the dynamic Mughal hegemony itself, which had fostered sophisticated economic networks,
Right.
and also growing contacts with the European international economy.
Ah, the bullion connection.
Exactly. The Europeans were bringing in bullion, gold, and silver and demanding artisan products. This further monetized the economy and created opportunities for these new classes to emerge.
So even something we might think of as fixed, like caste, wasn't really immutable during this time.
Not at all. It was constantly forming and changing in this fluid political environment.
The sources mention terms like zamindar or ryat for agrarian legal statuses.
Right, those define relationships to land and revenue.
But also terms like Bhadralagh and Ashraf in North India and Bengal. What do they signify?
They imply a kind of gentry people with both landed economic power and social status, and interestingly, applied across different castes and even religious communities.
And then there's Mahajan for merchants.
Mutsadi and Amla for managerial classes, people who work for the state, or large landowners.
And Malik for an agrarian boss. It really shows how economic power and social status were truly in flux, right down to the words people used.
Indeed. And here's another twist. Despite the dramatic decline in the military power of the Mughal center after 1707, the Mughal emperor surprisingly remained a fount of authority across India. His sacred mystique, if anything, increased as his military power waned.
That is counterintuitive. How did that work?
It's complex, but the legitimacy he offered was still valuable. Even the British, notably Governor-General Richard Wellesley later on, showed scrupulous regard for Mughal authority.
Which, ironically, helped them.
Exactly. It facilitated their success by allowing them to legitimize their own claims, fitting themselves into an existing framework of authority.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it means the sophisticated administrative culture, the kind meticulously documented way back in Emperor Akbar's Aini-Akbari around 1590.
Which was basically a comprehensive record of his empire's administration and society.
That culture continued to spread.
Yes, through literate Muslim gentry and Hindu writer castes like Kayasthas and Kurtris. They carried it across regions, from Delhi out to places like Bengal.
So this decentralization wasn't necessarily a breakdown. It sounds more like a redistribution of power built on an expanding commercial economy and wealth accumulated earlier.
That's a much better way to frame it. And alongside the big semi-autonomous regional states like Awadh, the Deccan, Bengal, you had a whole host of smaller local kingdoms.
And these weren't just chaotic fragments.
No, often they were remnants of older Hindu polities built on the power of dominant local landholding communities. The complexity is really key here.
And these weren't static entities either, were they? The 18th century saw the rise of these energetic warrior states.
Absolutely. Take the Marathas, for instance. They rose as this loose alliance of Deccan agriculturalists and pastoralists, becoming powerful Hindu warrior kings.
But critically, they didn't just smash the old order.
No, they actually adopted Mughal methods of revenue collection. Our sources note that a figure like Mahaji Scindia, a major Maratha leader, built an army with many Muslim soldiers alongside Hindus, often drilled by Europeans, and his revenue collection mirrored Mughal practices.
Interesting. So their identity was forged through things like the Marathi language and Hindu devotional religion.
But they used the tools of the empire they were challenging.
And the Sikhs.
Similarly, they originated from relatively humble Jat peasants. Their identity was sharpened by political and religious conflict, cultivated through the Khalsa Brotherhood, that distinct Sikh, martial, and spiritual community.
And they also eventually adopted Mughal methods.
Yes, in administration. What's crucial to remember is the ambiguous relationship these Hindu and Sikh powers had with the Muslim empire. Rebellion didn't always mean total severance. Mughal authority was often still recognized, at least symbolically, as the pinnacle of power.
Fascinating complexity. And then right down at the most local level, you had the village magnates.
Yes. Deep down, the crucial role was played by figures like the village headmen and patils in the Deccan, Munagars in Tamil Nadu.
Like little kings at the local level.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Controlling resources, fixing rents, arbitrating disputes, protecting village deities. An early British official even called them the most important functionaries in the villages and perhaps the most important class in the country.
That really brings home the idea of distributed power, doesn't it?
It does. And what stands out here, and might surprise you, is that despite all this political fluidity and conflict, many areas had established rich peasant elites. In Rajasthan, for example, they made up maybe 10% of the rural population.
And elsewhere.
Agrarian magnates, or jotadars, in places like North and East Bengal, owned significant land and employed sharecroppers. This points to surprisingly well-developed internal markets, not just basic subsistence farming.
And economically, things weren't just collapsing either.
No, there was even slow agricultural improvement in many areas, at least until about 1760. And while old staples like Bengal piece goods, those fine textiles Europe loved, declined.
New commodities rose.
Exactly. Things like cotton wool from Gujarat, Malwa opium, which became hugely important for the China trade, and indigo. The economy was adapting, shifting, not just declining.
And a critical change occurred after 1757, right, after Plassey.
Yes, this directly impacted the economy. The East India Company largely stopped importing bullion, gold, and silver into Bengal.
Why?
Because they could now use the region's own cash revenues, the land taxes, to finance their trade to Canton and London.
What effect did that have?
It caused a severe credit crisis, lots of complaints about dearer money and trade recession. But interestingly, it didn't completely demonetize the economy. In fact, Indian bankers and revenue farmers became even more important, financing both political and military activity in this cash-strapped environment.
Wow. And finally, here's a truly counterintuitive detail you mentioned earlier.
Yes, the cultural flourishing.
The 18th century, despite all this upheaval, was a period of remarkable creativity in Indian religious and cultural life.
It really was. For Hinduism, you had learned traditions flourishing in places like Benares. In Tanjore, down south, there was a fascinating fusion of Vaishnavism and Shaivism, producing rich poetry and dance.
And Islam
also saw a vigorous developing tradition. Important teachers like Shah Waliullah and Shah Abdulaziz in Delhi were highly influential. The Chishti Sufi order spread widely in Punjab.
And even ordinary people's beliefs were adapting.
Yes, ordinary Hindus were even incorporating what might be seen as dangerous forces like warriors into their belief systems. It shows the remarkable adaptability and resilience of Indian imaginative and spiritual worlds.
This was absolutely far from a stagnant society just waiting for external change.
Far from it, which sets the stage perfectly for the next part of the story.
Right. All of this incredible internal dynamism truly sets the stage for the East India Company's ascendancy and how India was transformed.
Because the British weren't stepping into a void, were they?
Not at all. They were drawn into India's complex politics by the lure of profit and the intricate interplay of existing markets and power structures.
And their real success, at least initially, came from combining military services with their expertise in managing and extracting cash revenues. They became players within the existing Indian system.
A key mechanism they adopted, or rather adapted, was the subsidiary alliance system.
And here's a crucial insight.
Yeah.
They actually copied this system from existing Indian powers. It wasn't a totally novel British invention.
So how did it work?
Well, in return for tribute, often paid through cession of territory, the company offered military support troops trained in European methods to Indian rulers.
Okay, sounds like a security arrangement.
On the surface. But what does this all mean for the big picture? Ironically, this system may be initially designed to secure stable frontiers for the company.
Yeah.
It became a primary driver of the unlimited extension of British control.
How did that happen?
The financial strains it imposed on Indian states paying for these expensive troops often led to rulers falling into debt, troops mutinying over pay, which gave the British excuses to interfere more, demand more territory, or even annex the state entirely.
So it was a kind of self-perpetuating cycle of expansion.
Exactly. A constant creeping erosion of local authority.
We see this played out in various places, right? Like Bengal.
Definitely. The company seized control there in 1757, after Plassey. But it wasn't just for political power.
No, it was about the money.
Absolutely. They used Bengal's vast revenues to finance its trade, to Canton the China tea trade, and to London, completely reshaping the internal economy.
And the permanent settlement of 1793, that famous land revenue reform.
It aimed to stabilize revenue by creating a hereditary landed aristocracy, kind of like in Britain, but in practice.
it didn't quite work out that way.
No, it primarily benefited literate, high-caste speculators and intermediaries, rather than leading to direct agricultural improvement by the old zamindars. It created new winners and losers, disrupting existing social structures.
And what about down south? Arcot and Madras.
There, the Nawabs became clients, essentially dependent on the British, but British creditors and, frankly, rampant profiteering by company officials severely damaged the state's finances.
Leading eventually to
Annexation. And on the West Coast, in Surat and Bombay, what's truly fascinating is that Indian merchant communities actually actively sought British protection at times.
Really? Why?
To guard against disruption from local conflicts or Maratha raids, they even urged the British to seize Surat Castle in 1759 for stability.
So it highlights how Indian interests or perceived self-interest could sometimes actively spur British expansion. It wasn't always just coercion from the outside.
Precisely. It's much more complex.
The rise of British power also led to significant changes within the cities themselves, right? Urbanization and segregation.
Yes. Early company settlements like Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay started as relatively multiracial, community-based cities. Indians and Europeans lived, well, more alongside each other.
But that changed.
It did. Here's where we see a distinct shift, especially after about 1770. European populations began to assert dominance much more clearly.
How?
Spreading into areas previously occupied by Indians, often called Blacktown. And official policies started reinforcing this.
Like barring people of mixed race from government service in 1793.
Exactly. That emphasized racial separation. This led to a new colonial character in these cities. European-style garden houses, exclusive clubs and areas, a booming market and land specifically for Europeans.
And what about the Indian side of the city?
Simultaneously, new Indian oligarchies emerged, powerful landowners and moneylenders, often high-caste individuals.
How were they connected to the British?
They were often closely connected to the new British administration, benefiting from the new systems, and perhaps less dependent on traditional trade networks.
And they displayed their wealth.
Oh, yes. They built elaborate palaces, and, interestingly, the sources suggest they contributed to what's called a more rigid form of modern Hinduism.
How so?
Through extensive temple building and patronage of specific rituals, perhaps as a way to solidify their own status and legitimacy in this rapidly changing world.
Then comes Richard Wellesley as Governor General, 1798 to 1805. This period marked a significant shift, didn't it? Towards a new imperialism.
Yes, this wasn't just opportunistic expansion anymore. Wellesley represented a more coherent imperial policy.
What did that emphasize?
The power and dignity of the state, the supposed morality of conquest, and, quite explicitly, British racial superiority. He was much more assertive, much more ideological.
And think about the justification they used. Wellesley rationalized conquest by claiming contemporary Indian rulers were tyrannical usurpers.
Right, suggesting they weren't legitimate rulers.
And that British policy aimed to restore some mythical, ancient Hindu constitution, as he claimed in Mysore after defeating Tipu Sultan.
It was a powerful ideological reframing, wasn't it? Painting the British not as conquerors, but as restorers of some older, purer order.
Yeah.
Very convenient.
And during his time, the British Indian Army expanded dramatically.
Hugely. From about 115,000 to 155,000 men. It became one of the largest European-style standing armies in the world.
With formidable cavalry and advanced logistics, too, like those huge pack-bullock herds for supply trains.
Exactly. Logistics were key to their success. And crucially, military concerns directly shaped how they administered India.
How did that work?
New revenue systems, like the Ryotwari system, where revenue was collected directly from individual cultivators, bypassing intermediaries,
Yes.
were primarily designed to fund these massive armies.
Yeah.
Reliable cash flow was paramount.
And military men often took civilian jobs.
Yes, military personnel often filled key civilian administrative roles, blurring the lines between military occupation and civil government. Military needs drove policy.
This expansion naturally put immense pressure on the remaining Indian states. You mentioned Benares earlier, in 1781.
Yes, the company's relentless demand for tribute, combined with an unpredictable revenue system they imposed, ultimately led to Raja Chet Singh's revolt,
Which was swiftly suppressed.
showing the tightrope Indian rulers were walking. And in Awadh, around 1801-1802, and Arcot in 1800.
What happened there?
European commercial penetration merchants, moneylenders linked to the company, actually weakened these states from within. By diverting revenue away from the rulers and strengthening decentralized forces, local chiefs, and so on. This internal weakening paved the way for their eventual annexation.
But states like Mysore under Tipu and the Marathas, they were militarily stronger, right?
Yes, they posed a much more dangerous threat, precisely because they had started developing European-style infantry and modern gunnery. They were adapting militarily.
So how did the British overcome them?
Well, the British skillfully exploited internal divisions like the constant factional disputes among the Maratha chiefs. But ultimately, their defeat highlights the British ability to centralize resources, money, troops, supplies from across the entire subcontinent, and sustain campaigns over long periods. Indian powers, more regionalized, generally couldn't match that sustained large-scale mobilization.
Okay, so let's move into the period after the major conquests, say 1818 to 1857. This is often called an age of reform by the British.
Yes, but it coincided with significant economic malaise for the company itself.
So despite their dominion, things weren't running smoothly.
Not financially. India's agricultural economy simply wasn't underwriting the massive costs of this vast European military and administrative enterprise. They were consistently spending more than they were reliably getting from the land tax.
And their pacification efforts during this time, what did those involve?
Some interesting approaches. Converting potentially troublesome tribal leaders into compliant rajas, creating special military units like the Bill Corps to channel traditional military energies into company service.
And controlling land.
Yes, parceling out so-called wasteland to create private property, which helped them fix populations and extend revenue collection. It was about control.
Now, this raises an important question about those reforms. Governors like Lord William Bentinck are famous for suppressing thugs, outlawing Sadi in 1829.
Abolishing Persian as the official court language, introducing English education.
Right. These are often lauded as major modernizing reforms. But our sources suggest maybe not.
Well, they suggest their actual social impact was often limited, at least initially. Many of these reforms aligned with shifts already happening in some sections of Indian society, or they focused on symbolic issues rather than fundamentally overhauling the social or economic structure.
And the economic situation in the 1830s and 40s?
There was a distinct economic malaise, as the source calls it, a sharp depression in agricultural prices, especially severe in Madras.
What was that?
It was exacerbated by the company's heavy revenue demands, often fixed in cash. When prices fell, farmers had to produce and sell even more just to pay the same amount of tax, flooding already glutted markets. It was a vicious cycle.
And the decline of the old Indian courts also played a role.
Yes, the high-spending Indian courtly elites, who used to be major consumers of luxury goods and services, were diminished. This significantly reduced demand, further dampening the economy.
And all this while the company was fighting more wars.
Exactly. Frontier wars during this period in Punjab, Afghanistan, Sindh further strained the company's already precarious finances, exposing its vulnerability.
The disastrous First Afghan War, 1838-42.
A catastrophe, led to the devastating loss of around 20,000 people, soldiers and camp followers, and triggered a serious reevaluation within the company about the loyalty of its own soldiers, especially the Eastern Indian sepoys from Bengal and Awadh. Seeds of distrust were sown.
Which brings us inevitably to the monumental 1857 rebellion and its complex legacy, a testament perhaps to a resilient India.
Absolutely, and is crucial, as you said before, not to view 1857 as some unique, isolated bolt from the blue.
Right. Our sources emphasize that armed revolt was, in fact, endemic throughout early colonial India. Resistance was constant.
What made 1857 different was its sheer scale and the unprecedented military threat it posed to British dominance, particularly in the strategically vital Gangetic Plains, the heartland of their power.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more. Some historians have dismissed it as just a melee of local factional conflicts or the arbitrary adjustment by the sword of the ancient disputes of the land, basically just local squabbles.
But our sources argue quite strongly that it was deeply related to colonial policies. Things like British attempts to control and tax previously independent territories. Think of the polygars in the South much earlier.
The immense economic pressures on landholders across the subcontinent.
And a widespread growing dislike, as the source puts it, of the British and their puppets. A general anti-colonial sentiment was building.
The spark, of course, was a mutiny of the Bengal Army sepoys in May 1857.
Yes, and we're told these sepoys had mounting grievances. There was the General Service Enlistment Act of 1856.
What was that?
It demanded that new recruits agree to serve overseas if required. For high-caste Hindu soldiers, crossing the sea risked pollution and loss of caste, a huge issue.
And the annexation of Awadh.
Yes, that directly affected many sepoys who came from Awadh. It impacted their pay, their status back home, their family land rights.
And then the infamous cartridge rumors.
That the new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindus and Muslims. That was truly the final spark that ignited the accumulated tinder.
The mutiny spread incredibly quickly from Meerut to Delhi,
where the aging Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, reluctantly lent his name and authority, giving the revolt a legitimate all-India symbolic center, even if his actual power was minimal.
And urban mobs, disaffected local leaders quickly joined in.
But here's where it gets really interesting and helps explain why it didn't, in the end, become a truly successful pan-India uprising. Despite the initial rapid spread, British power wasn't entirely eliminated, even in the areas around Delhi. And local groups often pursued their own ancient feuds, as the sources describe it. Loyalty to the rebellion itself was fragmented.
So old rivalries resurfaced.
Yes. And crucially, the impetus to revolt failed to spread effectively across the entire Gangetic Plain. The British managed to maintain control of key communication routes, the rivers, the Grand Trunk Road.
Indian disunity, then, played a significant role.
It did. In Awadh, for instance, while popular resistance was fierce, especially among the landowning cultivators who felt directly threatened by British policies.
Some big players held back.
Yes, some local magnates hedged their bets, didn't fully commit, and importantly, many of the new elites who had benefited from British rule in the controlled districts remained loyal to the company. Their interests were now tied to the British.
What about other regions? Gujarat.
In Gujarat, old suspicions of Maratha hegemony from the past, combined with the generally more lenient British tax regime there, fractured potential opposition. People remember the Maratha raids.
And Punjab. This is crucial.
Very crucial. The British had strategically worked hard to conciliate Sikh magnates and the powerful Jat village brotherhoods after conquering the region. Through generous service terms for Sikh soldiers in the company's army, relatively lenient revenue demands, and investment in irrigation projects which benefited agriculture.
So they felt they had a stake in British rule.
To some extent, yes. And there was also, frankly, a strong dislike among many Punjabis for the Hindustani sepoys of the Bengal army, who they saw as outsiders and associated with the old Mughal order. The British exploited that division very effectively.
And Bengal itself?
The British maintained a strong military presence there. And importantly, the zamindars created by the permanent settlement.
The landed class.
They had actually benefited from rising agricultural prices over the decades. They had less economic reason to revolt compared to landowners in, say, Awadh.
So the British were very adept at playing different groups off against each other, exploiting existing divisions.
Extremely adept. It was key to their survival.
The aftermath of 1857 was brutal, wasn't it?
Horrific. The British response was swift and merciless. Tens of thousands of suspected rebels were executed, often without trial. Villages were burned. It was about retribution and reasserting dominance through terror.
And it changed how the British ruled. Awadh and Benares, once key recruiting grounds,
ceased to be so. The trust was gone. So what does this all mean for the future of British India, the new Raj, after 1858 when the Crown took over from the company?
Well, the Punjab became the new favored recruiting area for the army.
Yes, and the British deliberately fostered caste and tribal segregation within the army. The martial racist theory took hold. They aimed to create a reliable mercenary force, loyal to the British, divided internally, useful for internal security and for deployment across the growing British Empire.
And they stopped annexing princely states.
Mostly, yes. They learned a hard lesson in 1857. Instead, they chose to work through the remaining princes, often guiding them via modernizing Indian Dimwans or chief ministers who were amenable to British influence. Indirect control became the preferred method.
So by 1860, India was truly locked into a pattern of imperial subordination.
Absolutely. With Indian taxation primarily financing the British Army, which was used as much for policing India as for projecting British power overseas.
However, there were profound, often unintended consequences of this whole period, weren't there?
Definitely. That ideal of a free peasant economy that some British theorists aimed for, it was only ever imperfectly accomplished, as the source says.
Why?
The persistent revenue squeeze, the pressure of cash taxes, and the economic depressions often damaged peasant capacity for investment. Profits were largely monopolized by moneylenders and landlords, not the cultivators themselves.
And the social conservatism of the colonial administration.
Reinforced by both the experience of early resistance movements and the sheer trauma of the 1857 rebellion.
Yeah.
It made them incredibly reluctant to intervene too much in the social structure.
Meaning,
They hesitated to tax the rich peasant effectively or enact strong reforms that would genuinely protect the poor tenant farmer. Existing inequalities often became more entrenched under the veneer of stability.
So a provocative thought for you, our listener, to take away from this deep dive. Our discussion, drawing heavily on this source, shows that India was fundamentally transformed by this first age of colonialism. That's undeniable.
But it was absolutely not a passive victim simply being acted upon.
No. The resilience of country people, as the source calls it, in adapting to new pressures, the rise of new entrepreneurial and educated classes responding to new opportunities, and the ongoing complex interplay of indigenous Indian forces and external European pressures.
Ultimately shaped modern India in ways neither the British nor Indians at the time fully foresaw.
Perhaps the true story of this period is not just of a foreign power imposing its will, but of a dynamic, complex Indian society continually adapting, resisting, collaborating, and in doing so, creating something entirely new.
And in many ways, a future that was still very much unwritten.